Terrific. I'm delighted to be here. My name's Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the executive director of the Harvard Law School Library, which is the largest private academic law library actually in the world. We have about 2 million physical items in our collection and daily acquiring new digital collections, particularly because of the COVID-19 situation, right? And our need really rapidly to spin up a very robust digital component of our library services. In academic and research libraries, it's really the resources that we have in our collection that become incredibly important and are sort of the cornerstone of the research that our faculty and students engage in. And in big libraries like those at Harvard, what makes us unique and special and why people really want to come to our schools to study with regard to the library is the resources that we hold. A lot of them are unique and are not available in a digital component. So that's been an interesting race that we've been engaged in this spring over the summer, and I think it will continue into the fall as all of Harvard classes are remote at the law school this year. Or this semester. We don't yet know what will happen at the end of the term. So in the academic space, and I'm speaking really particularly with law schools, but I think this translates to all of the academic space, K through higher education, our students rely on that face-to-face interaction in the classroom. And with regard to their learning resources, right, they use textbooks, which typically are in print format, although some schools do use electronic resources, digitized, a digital copy of an analog resource in order to engage in the educational endeavor. When we spun off campus, right, and again, across the globe, but particularly at the law school, I would say about 90% of the resources that our students were using to learn, so their textbooks and their resources, were in an analog format. And a number of our students, for a variety of reasons, don't own the analog format of their class materials, would rely on that analog format from the library. So immediately, sort of, I would say probably the very end of February, the beginning of March, as we were watching the disease progress across the globe and really coming to a deeper understanding that this may have a big impact on our community, we started in the library identifying digital copies of these print resources. And Harvard Law School Library has a pretty long and established history of engagement in digitization of print material. We digitized all of the United States case law from the colonial period to 2018. And so we were already primed, right, to do this massive sort of digitization project. And we were able to do it really rapidly so that we had about a week's notice between our students leaving campus and coming back in an online format. And we were able to either find or digitize the tools they needed in order to be successful in the classroom, in addition to supporting the remote learning experience that our faculty sort of very rapidly had to learn how to use Zoom. Harvard Law School does not have an online teaching component to its program. And the library was really engaged in helping the law school sort of gear that up and really transition our faculty into an online teaching space, which was pretty amazing. I think the lessons that we learned, right, are sort of like when we think about digitization, the need for connectedness, the need for strong networks, sort of the lessons that we learned in that period of time were that we're not poised for the long term, or we were not poised for the long term in March, April, May, to really be thinking about what education in an online space can look like. And from a library perspective, that really means how do we support the research endeavors? How do we connect individuals with the tools that they need? In our context, that's articles, books, objects, archival material, when they are dispersed across the globe, when they are not able to be in our physical spaces. libraries have, I would say, over the last 30 years, been making great inroads in that space, but it hasn't been a priority because it's so expensive. One of the transformative moments I think that has arisen because of COVID is a deeper understanding by sort of economic stakeholders of the need for investment in this space, that we cannot have an expectation that people will be successful in a digital economic environment without the baseline materials that they need in order to be successful. Again, sort of in this response of this moment, this global moment related to the pandemic, I think what we are seeing, what we can no longer ignore, for those of us who've chosen to ignore it, is how deep the digital divide really is, and how much that digital divide cuts across people of color, people from developing nations, people who are economically disadvantaged. And it's undeniable, in the United States, at least 21 million people do not have access to the internet, or stable access to the internet. That is typically represented by folks in rural communities and the working poor. So in an educational environment, right, one of the things that we discovered was that this plays out even at elite institutions, right, even at the university level, where we have stories of students who struggle to be successful in the educational space because of the lack of connection to the internet, or a unstable connection to the internet. So that's clear, undeniable. How do we manage that? I think we have to, again, prioritize creating moments and opportunities for people to not just have access to the internet, but to have some digital literacy, right? And the burden often falls in those underrepresented communities to places like libraries. So some really interesting stories that have come out again across the globe in response to COVID is the role that the library is playing in those underrepresented communities to try to give people access to the internet, whether that is through hotspots that people are able to bring home with them. It's leaving and boosting the Wi-Fi in the building so that people can come to the parking lot, right, to do their jobs, to engage in the educational environment. And so I think that this moment really should signal to all of us, and particularly to leaders in the digital space, that we need a strong economic investment, that we need to improve our policies around access to the internet, around fiber optics, laying the cable, right? Like, it's not enough to say it's available in your community if the cable doesn't reach the front door of the individuals most affected by the digital divide. And we have to make it affordable, which is a huge problem in the United States, I think, as many of us are aware. When we think about sort of how, and then how do you create that? How does that become inclusive? How does it create diverse and equitable workplaces, right? Where we are in a self-referring moment. If you have access to the tools you need to be successful, whether that is an adequate education, and in this context, access to the internet and all of the riches that we can find through digital objects and digital work. If you don't have access to that in kindergarten, in middle school, and high school, you cannot enter the digital economy, right? There's already a bar there. And so I think the experience many people have had in COVID with a rapid return to your home to engage in work, and so really seeing sort of on a daily basis what it means to have inadequate internet coverage for people of privilege may actually shine a spotlight on what that experience is like for those who are not as privileged. If we really want to have a diverse workforce, we need to ensure that all members of our communities, in all of our communities, have equal access to what has become in the 21st century a basic need. You know, I think that there are, so in the library space, as we think about the work that we do, a large component, and one of the challenges to moving into an online workforce is that a large component of the work in libraries is still related, still requires human intervention, face-to-face work, hand to product work, right? And so we're not fully out of the sort of day-to-day physical labor of work in libraries. And so I think as the work from home prolongs, the opportunities for the folks whose work cannot be replicated in an online space diminish, right? And so we are seeing in the library community broadly in the United States, and I would assume that's also happening overseas, library staff losing their jobs because it does not translate into a digital space. So how do we rethink library work, and how do we rethink our contributions to our communities in a digital space that allows us to retain really exceptional people who have brought to our spaces in our communities a sense of connection? That's the piece that's not as easily translated into the online space and just creates a problem. So in a when we're thinking about digital transformation, I don't think there's 100% resolution to unemployment, right? Because not all work can be replicated in a digital space. If we can, and I think this gets to another question, is we're sort of thinking about talent, upskilling and reskilling our staff. If we can continue to build our staff capacity and knowledge in digital, in the digital framework, how can we replicate or improve on face-to-face human in-person contact into that online space? That creates new opportunities, sort of certainly within the. Yeah. Well, and I think libraries are very much human-centric spaces, right? And so I think the tech readiness and innovation certainly are like incredibly powerful tools when we're thinking about economic development and competitiveness. And in the library space as nonprofit organizations, right, our goals and objectives are a little bit different than in the for-profit space. However, some of the things that we've done at the Harvard Law School Library pre-COVID that I think can serve as examples while we're in this moment and moving forward is looking at the resources that we have within our building that we can legally and legitimately replicate in an online space. For example, which I referenced earlier, our Case Law Access Project, which has sort of freed millions of pages of legal decisions from all of the courts in the United States for use by researchers, for use by individuals who otherwise would not have access to the law, right, of the United States. That innovation, that sort of idea that we could take something that has been hidden behind paywalls, hidden behind the four walls of public libraries, hidden inside of books, difficult to find, difficult to manage, difficult to navigate, releasing that information out into the public, I think, is an example of where thinking innovatively and outside of, in our case, a for-profit framework, the for-profit community owns, right, in lots of ways, access to information. And so libraries definitely have a role to play in freeing that information, which then leads to sort of referring back to the other questions we've already answered. When you have access to information and when we can actually make information free, and by free I mean low cost or without cost, to as many people as possible, we then create economic opportunities in the sense that people are gaining access to education. They're gaining access to the resources and the tools they need to develop themselves as people, to then add value back into the corporate space, the employment space, the social space. And so I'm not sure if that's really getting to your question, but it's something that arises to me as I sort of think about, from a library perspective, how can we be adding value to the economy or the economies that we're engaged in. And I really do think it has always been and continues to be connecting people with information, the tools and the resources that they need. We need to continue to move as much of our services into an online space as possible. And the tension there, getting back to sort of the diversity equity question, access to information, we have to simultaneously maintain it in a physical location. And until everyone has access to the online space, we're running basically two businesses, and we have to replicate in person and online. And that creates another level of tension that can sometimes force us to make choices around innovation in the digital space versus innovation in the physical space. Yeah, I think as we're in libraries thinking about how we continue to add value to our communities and how we continue to engage in these conversations, for libraries particularly, we have to continue to educate ourselves and continue to grow and develop in our skills. And then that's what we can offer to our communities, right? So to stay connected to our networks, our like literal networks of people, we need to be really working hard on our value propositions and taking the time to explore the services and the tools that we offer to folks in the digital space and be able to translate that to those stakeholders. And that for us it's our faculty, it's our students, it's our board of governors, it's, if you're in a public space, it's the legislators, the funders of all of the work that we do, to try and help them see the value of transforming our industry, thinking about libraries as an industry, into a really robust digital space. And libraries tend to focus on the services and the resources that we provide to our communities. I think we need to really be engaged in conversation with internet service providers, with regulators who are looking at broadband regulation. We need to be talking about and thinking about how we toggle access to the internet. Net neutrality, which is clearly an issue here in the United States, should be at the forefront of what we're thinking about. And so I think the best practices for people in our industry is to stay as educated and really be activated in the advocacy space, not just about the services that libraries provide, but everything that hangs off of that, because we cannot do our work in a digital space unless our communities have access to the digital space, period. I would say it's going to be okay. I would say that we're better prepared than we thought that we were. And by that I mean, although we had to make decisions very quickly about sending our staff home, about how we were going to keep our community connected to the resources that they needed, all of the work that we've been doing all along, again, having a bigger focus in the digital space than perhaps some other libraries have the opportunity to be, put us in a place where we were able to rapidly transition. And so Jocelyn in February would say, the work that you do in advance of the crisis, even if you can't anticipate what the crisis will be, is going to get you through that moment and creates an opportunity for success in ways that we didn't imagine. You know, we had already been thinking about our collections. We spend a lot of time thinking about how we connect to our communities, again, in that sort of traditional analog face-to-face space. So because we spend a lot of time thinking about that, it was less difficult when we took a breath out of the panic, right? To take a breath out of the panic and say, this is easier than we think it is. Let's not complicate it because we're in a digital space. And that may be one of the pitfalls of when we think about digital transformation, is we sometimes make it more complicated than it needs to be. If we keep people at the center of what we're doing, it doesn't have to be complicated.